To talk about Salesforce development and show you everything that we've been working on. I wanted to actually start off first by apologizing. So it turns out my email address was incorrect on the speakers list. So until today, I didn't know that there was a set of slide templates. So I have my own, and I didn't try to change them at the last minute. So if you see some differences there, that's why. So apologies. But I did want to start off first by thanking all of the sponsors for the event. I've been participating and speaking at and attending events for a very long time, and I know that these cannot happen without the contributions of time, money, effort from all of these sponsors. So please, if you haven't, make sure to go out and talk to these sponsors, find out what they do, learn about their products and their services, and I'm sure it'll be a worthwhile thing. So for those of you who are sponsors in the room, thank you very much for helping to sponsor this event. I am going to be making some forward-looking statements today. So as with some of our former speakers, you've heard us talk about this, but please do not make any of the buying or purchasing decisions based on the contents of my presentation today, even though hopefully you may want to. But the one thing I will say as a caveat is that everything I'm going to talk about today you will be able to use in some form or another. So most of it is beta or pilotable right now. And I will be very open about our release schedule, and I'll tell you when these things will go GA. And it's in the not too distant future, so hopefully that'll be good news for all. My name is Wegner. I am a product manager at Salesforce. Here's all my contact information. I tend to be pretty active on Twitter as well as GitHub, so I especially on the weekends, start getting some free time, and I'll just start building some stuff and sharing it. So would love to connect with you and collaborate on projects, so feel free to look me up. And I thought I'd actually start real quick with some background, tell you a little bit about myself, because, well, I'll share kind of a brief history of my career. Some of you may already know it, but I first started off as a consultant, so I did a lot of consulting back in the early days of .NET. So I was a .NET developer for a long time. Then I ended up doing a bunch of Microsoft-related consulting, did a lot of services integration work. Anyone BizTalk developer here? Anyone do some BizTalk work? One person? Two? All right. So I did a bunch of BizTalk for a while. And then eventually I joined Microsoft. So I spent about, 5 years at Microsoft, working largely on Azure. So I was one of the first engineers on Azure. I worked on the what we called RDFE, the Red Dog front end, which was the API service management control plane for Azure back in the earlier days. And so I did a bunch of work as an engineer there. I actually eventually got into evangelism, which was fun. So I got to travel around the world talking at conferences about cool technology. But eventually I ended up coming to Salesforce. And so I joined Salesforce, gosh, probably 4 years ago. And as a Salesforce evangelist. So Adam Seligman, who I knew from Microsoft, hired me and came in to join the team and to talk about the platform. And I actually think the largest contribution I made while I was at Salesforce at that time was the .NET SDK for Salesforce. Does anyone use that? Anyone use it? No? No .NET developers? But shortly after that, I actually went back to Microsoft and went back to Microsoft, focused on Azure engineering, and built some cool stuff, had a lot of fun, and then came back to Salesforce about a year and a half ago. So I'm not sure, I've never quantified or validated it, but I think I'm the only person that's done Microsoft, Salesforce. So, but I'm here at Salesforce, I think, for good, because I'm having a ton of fun, and I think the rest of the presentation will highlight why. I also wanted to mention a little bit about some of my passions. So for those of you that do interact with me on Twitter or elsewhere, you know that I have a strong passion for craft beer. I've been an avid home brewer for a long time. That's my brewery in my garage. My wife parks on the other side of the garage. So there is room for her to park, but this side is mine. It's a custom-built rig. I don't know, any home brewers here? Anyone brew? No .NET developers, no homebrewers.
I drink.
You drink, okay. Well, so it's a setup that I made from scratch. So I take my hobbies seriously. So I really get into it and really into the automation of it and trying to control all the variables so that I come up with beers that are not only good, but I can actually make them again. So I get as much of the stuff locally as I can. There you can see the boil, there's the mash, and this right here is a picture of a Kolsch that I made not too long ago, and it's not filtered, it's all natural, it's delicious. So if any of you are ever in Redmond, Washington, where I live, feel free to let me know and come on by and try some of the beers. So, but that's not why you're here today, so we're going to talk about development, and the first thing I wanted to do is actually just kind of orient you to all of the teams that have been working on a lot of the technologies that I'll be highlighting today. And so these are the teams that both myself, as well as Vlad, who's a product manager on our team, represent. And these are the teams building most of the developer services, most of the developer tools, and then all the different mechanisms that we provide for distribution and deployment on the platform. So, new to folks. And some of these concepts, I will say, are different. If you've been building on the platform for a long time, we are making some changes, and I think for the good. And it's designed to make this more accessible for teams and developers and everyone else. I'll talk a little bit about how you can start adopting it. It's not a zero-sum game. You don't have to adopt everything. You can start to do some incremental things, and we'll talk about that. Kind of core to everything with respect to SalesforceDX is facilitating continuous integration as well as continuous delivery. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about CI, because one of my goals is that all of you are able to introduce some level of automation into your development practices so that you can end up benefiting from that automation. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about packaging 2, which is our next generation packaging technology that really gets to the heart of what we want to do with respect to the distribution story on our platform. How do we manage change over time across different environments? So, and then I do have a couple of new things that I want to highlight today, some stuff that I may have alluded to on Twitter that I wanted to share. And so I've packed that in there as well. So the last thing, and I had a lot of fun putting this slide together. It's really neat to be able to pull this, but I truly believe that there's never been a better time to be a developer on our platform. If you went to Trailhead DX or if you saw this keynote through the live stream, there are so many things that the platform is bringing today, even beyond the developer experience. Platform events is amazing. The ability to use that event bus to subscribe and publish events is fantastic. And if you're building integrations that go in and out of Salesforce, you're going to absolutely want to take a look at that. Einstein and all of the artificial intelligence services, the predictive analytics, are fantastic. Like I've even been building with Einstein APIs. We have a Slack channel, and I built a bot that monitors all the public mentions of SalesforceDX, and it pumps it through not only a sentiment analysis service provided by Einstein, but I also created my own intent model so that we could route and notify teams if necessary. And all of this stuff is super accessible, it's super fun, and I gotta just say, I think there's never been a better time to be a developer for Salesforce. So hopefully you agree, and if not, we'll talk about it at happy hour. So as I always start with this when I talk about DX, and that is why. What were the driving, motivating factors for us with respect to taking a look at and honestly rebooting the development experience? It really comes down to a bunch of these things here. So about a little over a year and a half ago, a bunch of very smart people, I was not involved, got together and started meeting with actually a lot of you, ISVs, customers, to find out what are the hardest things. And from these conversations, a set of principles were laid out. And these have not changed. These principles have stayed exactly the same for the last 2 years. And they've been our guiding principles for all the decisions that we've been making. And so it starts first with the notion that everything is driven from source code. So Salesforce is a unique beast. If you think about the Salesforce org, it is not just metadata, it's not just data, but it's also the runtime. It's the entire service running together at the same time, and that has a lot of very unique and powerful attributes, but it also introduces some complexity as well. And so many of you have probably worked in sandboxes and production environments, and where's the source of truth? Does the source of truth, is it in production? Well, we made changes here and we pushed, so managing that is very complex. And so we wanted to say, hey, software engineers have figured this out. In fact, figured this out a long time ago. And it's using modern version control systems and being able to represent source external to the service, the service environment where it's actually running. And so with SalesforceDX, we take that perspective that the source of truth is your source code and that source control system. leading from that, then you start getting a very interesting question. Well, what about the environment? What about the environment that you're working in? If you start with source, what is the environment? And so we took this approach saying, hey, you know what? For developers as well as CI and automation, these environments need to be really easy to create. You need to be able to create them fast. They need to be empty. And then you need to be able to take that source and reproduce that application in a predictable way whenever you want. And so that was another core principle. Oh, and make it disposable as well, so that when I'm done, I can just delete it. And it doesn't end up being one of dozens of DE orgs or whatnot that I end up having forever. We wanted all of the development experience to be based on open standards as well as tools. So if you've got a particular tool chain that you like and you want to use, you should be able to use it successfully with Salesforce. We wanted to make sure all of this stuff facilitated continuous delivery, focused around teams. How many of you work with Salesforce as an individual? Like you're the only one, you don't work on a team. There's a few, okay, but the rest of you, you're working with colleagues and environments with complexity across multiple developers, and we wanted to really facilitate that kind of experience. This next one we're going to talk a little bit about because it's a bit of a change, and it's something that's going to be probably challenging for a lot of people, and that is that metadata in code is modularized, meaning that you find ways with which to say that this code relates to each other and this code relates to each other, rather than having one big, as we call, happy soup. And I'll dig into this a little bit. And then last, but certainly not least, is the last principle was using modern day notions of packaging as a way to distribute all of your changes. So these are all the principles, and this led to what we introduced at Dreamforce last year, SalesforceDX. And it's all focused on source-driven development, working as a team, facilitating CI and continuous delivery, and then being open and flexible, but at the same time prescriptive. And that may seem a contradiction, but we don't want you to be guessing at the best ways to be successful. We want to help show you the right methodologies to use, and then let you choose to use the tools in order to do that. Oh, and notice that I put that link right there to the release notes, so when I share the deck, we will be GAing SalesforceDX in Winter 18, which is right around the corner. Super excited, so hopefully you're all excited as well. So there's a lot to SalesforceDX, and I think when I jump into the demo here, I think that's the best way to kind of highlight and showcase this. But let me drill down maybe one click more. So source-driven development. One of the key things that we've focused on is this new experience for how you as a developer write code, get it into the environment with which you want to test it, effectively the runtime, and then if you make changes, being able to pull those changes back down into your externalized code base. So I'll show you that. If you haven't seen it before, you're going to be like, wait, what? You're doing this against what? This is Salesforce. It's really slick, it's really empowering, and I think you'll like it. We also have introduced a new kind of org. It's called a scratch org. Or if you're Daniel Bollinger from New Zealand, it's a burner org. He's determined to get us to rename scratch orgs to burner orgs. But basically, scratch orgs are created from scratch. You create them when you need them. They're empty. You push all your stuff into it, and when you're done, you delete it. And if you don't delete it, we'll delete it after a period of time. So these are ephemeral environments that you can end up working with. We put a lot of time and effort into a new command line interface, and so I'll be using that to drive a lot of the experiences. And I'll say up front, everyone first asks, like, is the only way to work with DX through the CLI? And the answer today is yes. But one of the teases and one of the things I'm going to show you is that we plan to bring a lot of these capabilities to user experiences as well, and so I'm going to give you a sneak peek of some of that. So we first started to focus on the command line interface because it's been easiest for us to work on a lot of these platform primitives and deliver them to developers, and then over time we can continue to layer on top of that and provide it to others as well. We put a lot of time and effort into a whole new set of language services, and so you can see this expressed in the new Visual Studio Code extensions that we've built, so I'll highlight that during the demo. One of the questions we always end up getting is, well, with DX, are sandboxes important? The answer is absolutely yes. You'll see that scratch orgs are not a replacement by any means for sandboxes. They're very good at certain use cases, and they're actually good at things that sandboxes are not particularly good at. Getting them immediately, being able to do whatever you need with them, to have a zero state from which you can build upon. Those things scratch orgs are really good at. But what they're not good at is, user acceptance testing. It's not good at testing against environments that replicates production environments. And you'll see when we start talking about code modularity, scratch orgs are not your full production org. So you need still the sandbox in order to test what you're building against everything else that lives in production. So sandboxes are still critical. CI, I think that's transparent. Packaging 2 we'll get into, and then continuous delivery. So I'm going to start moving here. Not going to spend a whole lot of time here, though. The key part that I want you to take away here is that what we're really focused on is a continuous life cycle where you're making changes, you're pushing updates into production, you're getting feedback, you're getting bugs, you're iterating, you're doing it again, and it's just a continuous process. And so with that, I'm going to do my very best to demo while holding a microphone. So, not that yet. All right. Oh, thank you, sir. So I told you I was going to start here in the command line, and I think this is because today, as a Salesforce developer using DX, this is going to be really tough. All right. Command line interface, and this is available for all platforms. It's actually built on the Heroku CLI. So if you're familiar with the Heroku CLI, I think it's going to be pretty transparent in terms of its usage. And you can see there's a lot here. So the first thing I want to highlight is that this CLI is not only for operations provided by SalesforceDX. If you do anything with Salesforce in terms of development, the CLI is super useful. You can execute anonymous Apex. You can do SOCL queries. You can end up doing all the different packaging commands, whether they're current managed packages, unmanaged packages, etc. You can use this for data import and so on and so forth. And so it's a very, very powerful tool. The other thing about it is that it's not just for developers, but it's for your CI systems. And so when you start automating things through scripts and so forth, this CLI is perfect for it. So for instance, if you look at the various auth... Oh, sorry, I'm going to try to clear it and get it to the top of the screen for those of you in the back. If you look at the auth commands, you'll see that we not only have an interactive OAuth flow to log into your Salesforce org, we also support the JWT bearer OAuth flow, which is a certificate-based mechanism for you to do headless login. So if you've got an automated service and you need to be able to authenticate to a Salesforce org, this is the flow that you would use with the CLI in order to do so. Now, one thing that I think is fun to highlight is, oh, I did it wrong, pardon. No, wait, it'll be better. There we go. Is we have a cloud inside of the CLI, so I think that's pretty neat. No, more seriously, so let's kind of transition to, just for the sake of time, how you might get started with SalesforceDX. So one of the things that we have is a command for creating a new project. And so I'll highlight this a little bit in a bit, but I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new project. Now what it does is it scaffolded the beginning pieces and components that I'll need. So let me go ahead and open this up in Visual Studio Code and show you what we have here. Now the first thing that it does is it creates this project JSON file. Oops, sorry. I'll take it for a moment. It creates this project JSON file, and there's a number of important things here. The first is this package directory. Now, when you start working with SalesforceDX, and we're going to talk about code modularity here in a moment, you put all of your source code and everything that you do ends up being inside of a package directory, and we'll get to why in a moment. By default, we create this Force app package directory, so anything and everything you create can end up going in there. You'll notice that there's a space here for the namespace. So if you're an ISV today building a managed package, one of the things that you can do is put your namespace directly into this JSON file, and we'll decorate it across all of these source. This is a really nice advantage for ISVs not having to worry about the namespaces being decorated everywhere. One other thing to note, and actually I should have mentioned this before, is one of the key advantages to Scratch Org, especially for ISVs, is you can link the namespace to your developer hub so that every Scratch Org created can use the same namespace. So if you're a development team and today you've done a bunch of trickery so that everyone has their own namespace, and then when you merge all the code, it replaces it with the official namespace. Does anyone do that here? Okay, yeah. You don't have to do that anymore. So you can just all use the same namespace in your Scratch Orgs, and everything works great. There's also some other things here. You can change some settings, etc. The other thing is Scratch Orgs. So Scratch Orgs you create when you need to use them. And one of the great parts about the Scratch Org is that when you create it, you can provide a template for what is going in it. And so you provide that template as a JSON config file. And so you'll see here that I can specify the addition. So this could be, I'm not going to try typing at the moment, but it could be enterprise. I could change the org name. I could specify an email address. And then the most important thing is I can specify features and org preferences that I want enabled inside of this scratch org. So this is a great way, especially for ISVs. You can define a bunch of different configuration settings representing different types of org shapes, and then create scratch orgs to represent those different kind of org shapes. So it's a very empowering thing. You can end up building a development environment that represents what your production environment is going to end up looking like. Now, let's go ahead and one of the nice things about Visual Studio Code is I can get the embedded console. Do you mind again?
No.
And what I want to do is first create a scratch org. So I'm going to do this command org create -s. -s means make it the default scratch org for this project. -f, and then pass in that config file. And in Moments, what it's doing is it's actually going off and creating an org for me to use for my development purposes. And so this is very different from today's flow. Today's flow, if you want to develop with Salesforce, the first thing you do is probably go to developer.salesforce.com, sign up for a DE org, wait for those credentials to come back, go through a password flow, right, where you got to set that password, and then maybe in like 5 or 10 minutes you've got an environment with which you can start developing against. But it's a DE org, so that means that all the configuration settings, all the preferences that are set are based on that DE org template. Whereas here you can see from scratch, right like that, I've created an environment based on the settings that I want in it. And note that I didn't have to specify an email address or a password or anything. It just created all of it. So you can see here's that org. I'm actually going to come back here so I have more screen real estate. One of the commands we provide is this thing called force org display. So you can see some of the details about this org that was created. So we know that it was created by this user at our dev hub. Here's the access token. So one of the best parts of the CLI is once you either create a scratch org or once you log into a production org or a business org or whatever, we are able to store the refresh token such that we can mint up an access token whenever you need it. What that equates to is you never have to log into that org again, which is very empowering. You can just target that org, and I'll show you how in a moment. You can see a bunch of other things. Now, one of the things you'll note here is it doesn't show a password, and that's because the CLI is managing that access token. I can end up performing now operations against this scratch org and not have to specify that password. It will use the encrypted locally stored access token in order to do all that. Now, one of the other neat things about it is, here, let me clear this and redo it, is we have for every single command, we have the ability to return it as JSON. And this is really neat. So some of the things that you can do here now is anyone use JQ? It's a great JSON parser. I can do things like JQ.result. And so what I'm doing now is I'm actually, what did I do? Did I spell it wrong? There we go, okay. So it's parsing it like JSON now, and then if I do JQ.result, I can get just the result, and then I can even take that further and do username, and get the username. So one of the nice things about the CLI then is that as you build automation scripts, you can end up taking the output of CLI commands, piping it through something like JQ, and actually getting some of the output parameters. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But the fact that you get this back as, you can get all these commands back as JSON is designed for the CI systems. Now, what we've also got in the CLI here are the ability to create some things. So for instance, I can say Apex class create, and whenever you forget a command like ID, you can type --help. And so I'm going to say -n for my class, and then -d, and then specify the output. I'm going to say go to a classes folder. And so just like that, I've scaffolded some Apex, and if I look at that, you can see here, now I've got in my project an Apex class. So what to do with this? So I've got a scratch org, I've got a local class, maybe I've added a bunch of code to it, spent some time, it's time to get it into my Scratch org. So I'm going to do what's called a force source push. And this is where things start getting really exciting, because what I'm doing is I'm taking something local and I'm going to push it into the org. And it's not a dumb push. It will only push things that have changed. So if I try to run that command again, you'll see that there's nothing to push. So let's jump real quick now and go into the org. And so I'm going to type org open, and hopefully the DNS is finished propagating, and it has, which is great. It means that I talked long enough so that the DNS finished propagating. Let's highlight a few things here. So I'm in the Scratch org now, right? And again, realize the Scratch org here is my development environment. It's the runtime. It's the equivalent of doing Heroku local when I'm building a Node app or a Ruby app. It's the manifestation of the thing that I've been building. Now we don't have much here yet. You can see that I've got, as you'd expect, the Apex class that I've deployed. Yes, there it is, my class. But one of the things that is unique about Salesforce is that the org is more than just the runtime. There's a bunch of fantastic tools, right? You've got Schema Builder, you've got Lightning App Builder, you've got all of these things in the org that we can take advantage of. So one of the things I want to highlight here is doing just that, but doing it in an interesting way. So I'm going to come here to the Object Manager and go to Account. And let's go ahead and add a custom field to this account. And, again, I'm making changes inside of the Scratch org. And I'm using the tools to help me. So my text box, and they are always 255, for me at least. And we're going to go ahead and save that. So what I've done is I've made a change inside of the Scratch org. Now let's flip back to the CLI real quick and run another command, force source status. And one of the great things that we've introduced in the Scratch org are metadata listeners. And so we'll talk a lot more about this over the next several months and so on, but effectively we can track when metadata changes in the org. And this is significant. I'm sure many of you have written scripts to do a metadata retrieve and then do a diff against the metadata retrieve you did an hour ago to tell you what's changed. And that kind of sucks. But with this, we can actually start tracking what has changed, and in the future we'll be able to give you an API that just says, hey, what has changed in my metadata? For now, we're using it to power this kind of an experience so that when I make a change in the Scratch org, I can now do a force source pull, and I can pull those changes back down, because remember, the source of truth is my externalized source. It's the version control system that I'm using. The other thing that's really interesting about this is if you think about it, all I did is I created a custom field. Now I used a wizard. That wizard, I did a bunch of things that I may not have been aware that I was doing. I modified profiles. I modified page layouts. And one of the nice things about this method is that you can see that the listener rather, knew that other things had changed. And so when I did a pull, all of this stuff got pulled out as well. So let's come in here and take a look at this. And you'll see here's the object. Now, one of the things that's very exciting, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Oh, wow, that's maybe too big. Is look at the account object. One of the things that we're really focused on is a better source representation of metadata. Instead of having a custom object in one huge XML file, we've started to decompose that into things that make sense. So here are the fields. Here are the list views. Here are the web links. And then here's the actual, I'm going to make it smaller. Here's the actual account metadata for the account object. Now you'll note here that it's got everything. I'm happy to tell you in the winter release, it's smarter. It'll only pull the things that I created, not the entire account object. But that's something that you'll have in the winter release. But that's pretty cool, right? So like, does that reinforce the idea? Like you can write code locally, you push it into your org, you can use the org, make some changes, and pull that back. And development ends up being kind of an interplay across working locally on source as well as using the org for various things. If it doesn't make sense, I'll point you to a Trailhead module we have where you'll go through and build a really neat Lightning app, and hopefully that'll reinforce some of it. So I want to jump over here real quick to another demo, and I'm going to try to be more conscious of time because I tend to blather a little bit. Here I've got a script. Let me open up this build script. And I wanted to highlight a little bit of what I was showing on the command line before. What I did is I created a bash shell script. And you can see here, I've taken that, here's the SFDX command, I'll make this a little bit bigger. And I'm running, just like you saw me before, force org create, but I'm capturing the output. And then I'm using JQ to actually get the result, the org ID, the username, and then print that out. And then what's more is I use some of that information. For instance, here's the username. I'm using that to actually generate a password. And then I'm using some of that other information later on in the script to do different things. So let me run the script for you to kind of show how this chains together. So it effectively does what we did before, but it's going to create a scratch org. It's going to take the output information from that and then use it to do other things like actually generate a password for it and then display all this information. And so this is a key method that you'll end up using inside of a bunch of your build scripts in order to facilitate anything from unit tests that you might want to run to CI to continuous delivery, etc. All right, and then I wanted to show one other demo before moving on with the presentation, and that is a great example of an app built by Christoph on the developer evangelism team, and it's Northern Trails. I highly recommend taking a look at it. He's got a fantastic blog post about it, but what's nice about it is it's not only a fantastic representation of building a Lightning app and building Lightning components, it's got a lot of really interesting use cases around metadata in there as well. And so you can see there's a whole lot of different types of metadata involved in it. So what I want to do is go ahead and, actually for this one, I already created the scratch org, but it is empty. I just created it ahead of time so that I didn't have any DNS issues. So I'm going to go ahead and do a force source push, and we're going to push all this metadata into the scratch org that's been created. It's going to take a few moments because there's a lot more here. One thing I'll highlight while this is deploying is we've actually made a lot of improvements lately in our metadata API, including what we call internally a new costing engine. So in the past, when you do a metadata deploy, you'll end up in a queue somewhere, and then based on the queue depth, you may eventually, like within a minute or 5 minutes, your deployment would proceed. Even if you only had one little minor apex change that you wanted to do a deploy on in order to get, let's say, the compiler to tell you if it's accurate. One of the things that we can do in this new costing engine is actually take a look at that payload, and if it's really small, just bypass that queue so that this experience ends up being a lot more dynamic in terms of your ability to push and pull source back and forth. So notice that we pushed all this source, and right here you'll see that we've got a permission set. And so we're going to take advantage of that NTO permission set, and we're going to do a force user perm set assignment for NTO. And apologies for those of you in the back room I forgot to clear, but you'll see that in a moment. So that assigned the permission set to me so that I have access to all of the objects and to all the things that were created inside of the environment. And then I also want to highlight here the force data tree commands, or all of our data commands. Effectively, there's a lot of different data import capabilities. The one that I'm going to use here is actually force data tree import, and what that uses is our SObject tree API, so that I can point it to a file. And actually, here, let me show you this file real quick. Basically, it's some simple JSON files, and so it's got all of our sample data set up as JSON right here. So what I'm going to do is import that by saying import the plan data merchandise plan. And so remember, the scratch org is empty, right? So we're going to import sample data that we want to use, and then now I can go ahead and open this up. And so just in moments, what we've done is we've taken Christoph's rich Northern Trails sample application, which he put into a GitHub repo, pulled that down, created a scratch org, deployed the metadata, assigned the perm set, imported some sample data, and now you can see that Northern Trail application is here. And so all of this is fully automatable as well. But it's a great way to give it a try, and I think it's a good demonstration of some of the things that you can do. All right, thank you very much. So a lot more to cover. I'm going to try to start going through it because a lot that I want to talk about. So to get started, a couple of quick notes. DX will be available for every production and every business org. And so one of the things that I try to tell people is we are not, there will be no cost for DX. So hopefully that's good news to everyone if you thought that we were going to charge for it. We're not. You should not charge for development experience. I think you need to enable developers to build awesome things, not find ways to monetize them. So with the enterprise and with the unlimited editions, what you'll get is an allocation of scratch orgs. And so you'll get a certain number of scratch orgs based on which edition of the license that you end up having. And then if you're an ISV, you'll get a certain number of scratch orgs based on your partnership status. Now, if you don't want to enable the Dev Hub in your production environments today, maybe you've got a policy against using non-GA technology, which is totally legit, you can get a trial org that'll have the Dev Hub enabled, and then you can just get started today using that trial org. The reason why you shouldn't worry about trying the trial org is all the Dev Hub is a one-time login and specifying that that login is your Dev Hub account. From there on out, all your work is in scratch orgs and all your source is externalized. So starting in a trial org and then switching over to your production org for the Dev Hub is not a significant thing. You should not be worried about it. Feel free to just try the trial org today and enable it in your production org later. And I'm proud to say that he's also a contributor to it. So he wrote some code and sent it in a pull request, but it's a neat tool. So basically you can go to deploy.salesforcedx.com, log in with your Dev Hub, and let me log in again. Fortunately, the password is very simple. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And one of the things I've done is I've highlighted some of the repos that I already know work. Like for instance, if I open up Christoph's repo here, you'll see that there's also a deploy to SalesforceDX button. So you can just click a button right from a repo to do it, or you can come in, select what you want to do, like let's say the Dream House, and click deploy. And so everything you saw me do on the command line is now automated here inside of this tool. And what's really neat about it is it's based on a YAML file that you put in the GitHub repo, which instructs the service how to actually do the deployment. So if you've got a particular file that you want to do for data import, or if you've got a permission set that's unique to your app, or you want to run a certain set of Apex test suites, you can specify all of that. And so this will run, it'll deploy, and then just for the sake of time, you'll see at the end, it'll actually give you a URL with the front door so that you can just click it, and it'll take you right into that scratch org. So this is a great tool if you just want to try something out, see how it's working. If you yourself are a developer and you want to share an app or some code that you've built and you want to make it easy for other people to use it, this is a great option. So very excited about the deploy to SalesforceDX capability. Check it out. Actually, one thing I'll note before moving on to is it's all been fully open sourced. So if any of you have ideas, things that you want to do, take a look, try it out. I put very detailed instructions as to how to get it set up and running locally, and send me a pull request with your enhancements. I think that'd be awesome. All right. So there's that. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going to be new in Winter 18. So one of the things that I think will be most significant for those of you who are customers is we're going to give you the ability to create a scratch org that is the clone of your production org shape. Let that sink in for a moment. What that means is you don't have to worry about configuring all those different settings to exactly mimic what your production environment looks like. You'll be able to take a snapshot of your production org and that org shape. This is not the metadata, it's not the data, it's the org shape. So the perms, the limits that you've got set for it, all of that sort of thing. You'll create a org shape, and then you'll be able to specify that in the scratch org definition file, and then create a scratch org that is an exact copy of your production environment. So I think this will be awesome for developers to be able to make sure that they're developing an environment that looks just like their production environment. We are also making scratch org expiration configurable. So today in the beta, we expire after 7 days. Pretty much all of you have said that that's too quick. You want it configurable. We'll probably still leave the default at 7 days, but we're going to let you configure it up to 30 days. So now this doesn't change how many active orgs you can have at a time, but it means that if you want to have your active scratch org around a little bit longer, you can do so. So that'll be configurable. We are also, this is one of my favorite things, pre-assigning the my domain to our scratch org pool, which means when you create a scratch org, how many of you have been frustrated when you go to open it and you have to wait 3 minutes for DNS to propagate? So that shouldn't happen any longer because the DNS will already have propagated because the my domain would have been assigned well before it was created for you. So that's awesome. Hopefully you've seen the new VS Code extensions that we released. I was using it here. I didn't really highlight it, but that's based on a whole bunch of language services that we built for Apex, Visualforce, and Lightning. So that's very exciting. We're going to have a sandbox to sandbox clone pilot. So if you're setting up sandboxes and you want to be able to create a clone off of the sandbox that you've configured, we're going to be running a pilot soon for you to be able to do that. That'll be a great, I think, time saver for a lot of folks. You saw the decomposed custom object, right? How it broke up the object into multiple folders. We're doing the same for custom labels. And how many of you love the way static resources work today? Raise your hands. All right, no one raised. I didn't think so. We're doing a lot of work on static resources as well, so that you don't have to go through and do crazy things with static resources. They should just work the way that you'd expect them to locally. So that'll be neat. A lot of expanded metadata coverage for source-driven development. We are actually in the process now, so Heroku just released a new version of their CLI that's completely node-based, and they took out the old Go code. At any rate, this should be transparent for everyone, but it's going to increase a lot of the performance. It's going to increase performance. Basically, we're building on the Heroku v6 engine, and that'll be a great performance boost for everyone using our CLI. I talked a little bit about the costing engines, speeding up metadata deploys. We have a new Apex language service that will publish. So we have language services for Apex, Visualforce, and Lightning. In winter, we'll make the Apex language service available to anyone that wants to use it. And largely, you'd only really want to use it if you're building dev tools, like if you're Scott Wells building a Illuminated Cloud or something like that, you could end up using that Apex service. Hopefully you've seen what's coming for Visualforce, so the ability to have Lightning styles based on some awesome CSS work that the teams have done, so that'll be really exciting. There's 30 new Lightning components that'll be released. And then for those of you that are Apex developers as well, definitely check out the isParallel true capabilities, because that's going to really significantly speed up your Apex tests. And we can not only run it actually in parallel like twice, but we can even run 8 versions of your tests running at the same time. So that's great stuff. And then one last thing I wanted to highlight. So I know this is really small, I apologize, but if you look at the left there, that's the terminal experience you saw me working on, right? So if you look at the right, that's the same thing, but it's the UX. So one of the things that we started working on and that we really are hoping to preview here in the winter release, not maybe right away in the winter release, but sometime during the winter release, is this new user experience for interacting with DX. So that you don't have to end up driving everything from the CLI. So that you can interact with your environments, you can create scratch orgs, you can interact with packages. You can do the things that you want to do, but through the UI, through a user interface in a browser versus the CLI. So we know that this is something that a lot of people have provided feedback. Even honestly, DX is great for admins, and a lot of admins are willing to jump in and learn how to use the CLI, which is awesome. But not everyone will be, and so providing this experience in the browser is important. All right, here's the major release schedule. We're actually just about to hit that center, so we're GAing pretty much everything that we went through today, and we'll be bringing packaging 2, which I'll talk about here in a moment, to open beta. And then I put that spring 18 and so +1, +2, etc., because we've got a lot more things to work on, a lot more ideas, and we're just going to keep going. There's 4 really good Trailhead modules, and I'd really try them out while you're here and get that extra badge here for French touchscreen. All right, so adopting. I think I need to speed up a little bit. So one thing I want to highlight here is that adopting DX is not an all or nothing proposition. Best way to start, just download the CLI. Play around with the CLI. Log into one of your production orgs, one of your DE orgs. I guarantee you'll never want to do it any other way, because just the fact that you don't have to remember your passwords any longer is awesome. You can just do a force org open -u, whatever your alias is, and magically it opens up. It's amazing. It's awesome. Then look at adopting SalesforceDX for your continuous integration, your continuous delivery. If you already have CI set up, maybe you're using Jenkins or something like that, instead of using, let's say, maybe a developer sandbox or a DE org, use a Scratch org. There's actually a lot of just inherent performance improvements in Scratch orgs. You will find metadata deploy times drastically reduce. You will find that Apex test runs drastically reduce. And one of the reasons is we can make a lot of assumptions about that environment because it was created from scratch. And so we can provide a lot of performance optimizations. From there, take a look at doing source-driven development. So we'll talk about what that means for customers here in a moment. But start to externalize your source, put it into version control, and start to deploy and interact with your source that way. And then eventually, starting to adopt it across everything. Now, I've talked a little bit about this before, and I think this, I actually think this is a great visual representation of what I mean by the happy soup. So, for those of you that have had production environments around for a long time, how many of you have a great sense of what is in there? Does anyone know what's in their production org? No idea. So, this is somewhat, I mean, honestly, it's not that, maybe it's not as bad as I might be making it out to be, but it definitely provides some organizational challenges. And what's more is taking an entire org, everything that you've had in this org that maybe you've had for 10 years, and trying to externalize and drive some sort of continuous delivery process out of it is very, very tough. But you can absolutely be successful decomposing your production environments into modules. And so, effectively, just to reiterate it is, what we mean by modularization of your production environment is group the things that are related. Group things that can be tested independently from other things. Things that can be released independently. And then letting that source live in one project at a time. Now the key thing here is not everything will work necessarily in this model. And that's okay. You can be successful using these techniques even for subsets of the source that lives in your production environments. And this is why Sandbox is still so critical. Because it's sandbox environments where all of this stuff comes back together, where you can take the code that you're working with in a project, deploy it into the sandbox environment, and make sure that it works in the larger happy soup. Here's just some high steps, high-level steps for approaching it. Pretty straightforward. Use the CLI, set up the Dev Hub, create a project, update it based on the configuration settings of your production environment, get all the source from your environment, convert it into the new source form, commit it into version control, use source-driven development, and then use it for continuous delivery. It looks really simple. Yeah, there's a lot involved here, but it is actually very, very accomplishable. A couple of anti-patterns. I already mentioned this. Don't take your entire production org and export it. I talked a little bit about that. Instead, modularize it. Be careful with schema. Actually, it's okay to have multiple projects. In fact, one of the things that you can do, and there's some resources you can look at, is you can create a project, and in that project create multiple package directories. And one of those package directories could be all of your shared schema. And in another package directory could be your UI. And in another package directory could be your Apex classes. And so you can start to modularize even within a particular project. Be aware of shared objects. Whenever possible, don't run without having some sort of continuous integration. It's very important to be validating all your source all the time. Don't use production data in test environments. It's just generally not a good idea. Usually when we see security or PII issues and so forth with customers, it's because they took production data, put it into the hands of developers, and then So you generate sample data that you use, and then make sure that you're doing an integration testing and doing that often. All right, how am I doing on time? All right, we got a little time left. So CI, I'm going to go through this a little bit fast. One of the things that I'll highlight is we've got a great Trailhead module focused on CI. If you go through that Trailhead module, at the end of it you will have Travis CI set up, operating against your stuff, and it'll all be working great, and it's a great example. So these are the elements, making sure you've got a strategy for your environments, a version control strategy, automated tests, a test pipeline, and branching. So environments. Really, it comes down to a few things. So if you look at this, you've got development environments, you've got testing environments, and production environments. And I've tried to highlight here customers as well as partners. So you'll see like production order versus packaging order. Really, the key thing is, we'll get to a more complex scenario, but for the most part, as developers running CI, just start using scratch orgs. You don't have to use developer sandboxes or DE orgs any longer. Use scratch orgs. That's the most important thing. Now, in a perfect world where you're automating everything, the developer is doing all this stuff, they're pushing, eventually it gets to a refresh sandbox, and then you promote it into production. But the reality is that we know many of you aren't always regenerating those sandbox environments, right? Because for instance, like on a full sandbox, you can only do it once every 30 days. Even a dev sandbox, there's limits around how long it takes, how often you can do it. So a lot of people end up rinsing and repeating, right? They reuse the environment, they try to clean it up and so forth. And that's not the best way to do automated testing and ensuring that all that stuff works. And so what we end up recommending is actually moving to this model right here, where you write your code in a scratch org, you deploy it to a scratch org, you test it in a scratch org, and then you end up promoting it. And so in reality, your pipeline looks a little bit more like this, where you're using that testing environment, the scratch org, for continuous integration testing, all of that. And eventually what you're doing is you're promoting it into an environment where, like a UAT environment, which is a sandbox that's getting refreshed, that you manage all those changes, and then you'll use for verification. We call it internally like blitz environments, where you make sure that everything works in the context of everything else. And then eventually you could promote it to a staging environment where you've got, let's say, more recent refreshes of production data, run all those Apex tests again, and then eventually promote it to production. And then in terms of branching strategies, there's a bunch of branching strategies, and we've worked with a lot of different customers and partners, and honestly, there's no one-size-fits-all. If you want to use a Git flow branching strategy, great. This is kind of what this is going to be demonstrating. If you want to use a GitHub flow branching strategy, that actually works really well too. Both are worthwhile approaches. The key thing is have an approach. Have a version control strategy, have a branching strategy, and use it to drive this. Have that master, create a develop branch, then I as a developer create my branch, you create your branch. I'm going to do some work, you're going to do some work, you commit it back to develop, I'm going to do some more work, I'm going to pull from develop, I'm going to then push my tests that have been now validated against your tests or your changes into develop. Eventually we're going to push it into the integrated environment, and then it's going to go into production. I mean, these get even more complicated if you're, let's say you do a patch, right? Like there's a bug and you got to get a patch out there quick. You can have a patch branch. Just identify what your branching strategy is ahead of time and follow it. So kind of quickly summarizing, write a lot of tests. You can never have too many. And don't just write tests for the sake of code coverage. Not a great idea. Check in often and run your tests often as well. So scratch orgs are going to be a great empowering tool, I think, for you, because there's no reason that you can't end up creating a scratch org, deploying all the changes to it, running your tests, and then destroying that scratch org on every commit. There's no cost to you. And all it is a script that'll end up running. And the reason is you never want to break the build. Okay, so packaging. We'll try to get through this because I am running out of time here. Today's packaging technology is primarily focused on ISVs. And that's because ISVs are building applications that consist of a bunch of stuff that needs to then get installed into someone else's environment, right? And so a lot of the focus on that packaging has been around manageability rules, around protecting IP, around making sure things are secure, so on and so forth. What that means is customers don't really take advantage of packaging that much. And to be very honest, the development experience for managed packages leaves a lot to be desired. There's a lot of different things that are involved in getting that to work successfully. And so for those of you who have done it, hats off to you, thank you, but we're going to make it a lot better. And in doing so, we're making it available not just to ISVs, but to customers as well. So when you think about what is the future of application distribution on Salesforce, packaging is that future. So it's for everyone. There's a lot of reasons for it. It's faster. It's going to increase quality. It's going to decrease cost because of time, because of breaking, and so forth. And these are some of the base. Well, okay, here's the vision. It's everything I said before. A couple of updates for it. All right. So one of the things that we've done with packaging, first of all, is you don't need a packaging org any longer. Remember that principle that I mentioned before? Everything is focused on externalized source. So in next generation packaging, you create the package from source. So that's very empowering. It means that your CI systems don't need to have a packaging org that needs to stay pristine and kind of hands off and all that kind of stuff in order to work. You just create the packages directly from source. You also will be able to have more than one package using the same namespace. And so this makes a lot of sense for customers if you think about it, because they're going to want to start to create different packages representing different pieces of modularized code. And you don't want to have to create a new namespace for every single one of these. You can use the same namespace. This is also very powerful for ISVs because now you no longer have to end up doing things like marking everything as global in order to be able to access it from another package and inadvertently letting the subscriber access it as well. So you'll also be able to define package bundles. And what that means is you can define dependencies across packages. So you'll be able to say, here's maybe my base library of all the basic functionality I use across a bunch of things. And then I'm going to create a more specific package here that's going to be dependent on that base package. So, and then when you install that secondary package, it'll install the base package that's required as well. So you can do package bundles and have package dependencies across them. And all of this leads to a much better and richer versioning strategy for packaging. So it's going to, I think, be a lot easier. Now, one of the things that's going to be really exciting about this is for next generation packaging for ISVs, we'll still provide managed packages built on this newer technology. We're going to call it managed packages, and it'll provide the same manageability rules that you require today, and we'll actually introduce more and more over time. We're going to provide, though, what we call new flavors of packaging for customers. And to be honest, these new flavors will probably be well suited for a bunch of ISV use cases as well. And we're calling them today, and maybe this will change once marketing gets involved, but developer-controlled packages. And there'll be two flavors of these developer-controlled packages, locked and unlocked. And what that means is you can create a package representing source that lives in your production environment, and you can put it in the package and you can lock it down. And what that means is you can't change that metadata unless you update the package. And so for a lot of things, that's going to be really awesome, because that means now that you have control over that metadata, and it won't change in production and other environments without you knowing about it. But honestly, changing in those environments is part of the special magic that is Salesforce. And so the unlocked version of developer-controlled packages will allow someone to make changes to it, new version out. So you have to make sure that your process for an unlocked package is well managed, because unless you take the change and put it back into your source control and recreate the package with that change, you could end up overriding something. But we deal with this today already with metadata API deploys, so I think you're probably all going to be fine. So packaging is something that we've been running in a pilot. It goes into open beta in winter, which is going to be awesome, so all of you will be able to use it. The one thing that we're going to limit, though, in this beta is, at least initially, we're only going to allow you to deploy it into Sandbox environments. And this is because it is still part of beta. Packaging technology is serious stuff, especially for ISVs. And so when we go to GA, then you'll be able to start to support it in production environments. All right, I think I took a lot of time, so hopefully we've got some time for Q&A. And thank you for the opportunity, but are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Chuck. Just want to clarify something. On the DX test running for Winter 18, are you suggesting that there's new stuff that's going to be available you can't do today with the tooling API to run tests, like the parallel stuff and the concurrency? Is that new, total new?
So it's total new, yeah. So the parallel is parallel, and the ability to run parallel tests and stuff, that is new. It's not specific to anything DX related. It's a general enhancement to the Apex development experience. So yeah, you'll all be able to use that. It's going to be awesome. Yes, sir.
Profiles are always a tricky thing to deploy.
They are.
Is there how can DX help with that?
So the question is around profiles, and first of all, whenever possible, start using perm sets. That's number one. Perm sets are far more manageable. The permutations and complexities around profiles you can probably appreciate. It can get very difficult. I will be very honest and say I don't think we figured it out perfectly yet. So you do have the ability, as you saw, as you start making changes, we will extract profiles, and you can start to externalize that. But what happens is, what is going to be the source of truth for the profile, right? Because each project is going to have a different set of things related to a particular profile. And so the source of truth of a profile is actually something that's going to live not only in your production environment, but also across all of your projects that you create. So, like I said, do not yet have a perfect solution for it, but you will be able to extract profile information specific to the project you're working on, that kind of localized modular set of stuff, and to be able to work against it in the context of that project and then when you deploy it, it'll actually just merge it into whatever the existing profile definition consists of.
Okay.
But yeah, use perm sets whenever you can. Done.
Wade, you made a comment about the mock data that you would be using in your scratch orgs, and are there tools built into DX to help you create that mock data?
Yes and no. So I will say, like you all saw at the demo jam today, a great partner that's built some awesome stuff. We have a lot of data import APIs and all this stuff, but we do not have something to say, create a whole bunch of sample data for me. One thing that we did do is we created a command called force data tree export. And what you can do then is say -q and write a SOCL statement, and it'll export that and create the JSON file that you can use for the import. So what that means is you could create a scratch org, create some sample data, or maybe import some sample data, and then export it through that command. Now, in order to get highly relational sample data, that means you're going to have a very complex nested SOCL statement in order to do it, which can be done. It's not necessarily the prettiest thing, but that's our story today for sample data. This is another area where I think we're very dependent on partners to provide some really nice tools. So. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And feel free to come up and find me and ask any other questions. So, thanks.